Hello, it's good to be with you again, and today's recording is going to be on Susanna Young, that was born in 1795 and died in 1852. And Susanna is our great grandmother, and I want to share my screen so that you can actually see what let's see if I can find that screen. Give me just a second. That's not the one. Yes, it is. And back it up one and see if we can get back to the screen that we start on. Okay, sorry for the confusion. Taking a look at that. Now I think we're on the right screen share. Susanna Young was my second great grandmother. So if you're my child, it would be a third great grandmother, or a grandchild, a fourth great grandmother. And she is Nada's father's mother. So Charles Henry Oliphant's mother, and the father of Charles Henry Oliphant is Richard A. Oliphant. So let's take a look at Susanna's life and just see what kinds of experiences she had and where she fell. This is another look at where she falls, starting with me at the bottom, my father and mother, and so forth, going on up. I won't take any time on that slide though, because I want to show a little bit about her family first. Her father was John Young and her mother was Abigail Nabby Howe. And Susanna is the sixth living, seventh child for the Youngs. This girl was not even named because she only lived a little while. Her name is not recorded in anything we know of. She probably was named. There were 12 children in this family. And so Susanna was about in the middle. And then as you'll notice, Brigham Young and some of the other names that we recognize, Joseph Young is younger than her, and Phineas Howe Young. All these are names that you might recognize from church history names. Well, Susanna then was born in 1795, married a James Little in 1815 at the age of 20. Her mother also died about this time. And James and Susanna had 4 children. And in 1816, after a year of hard work with his father at Tyrone, Brigham, age 15, and his brother Lorenzo, these are younger brothers of Susanna, remember, age 9, went to live with their sister Susanna. So she'd only been married a year, and here Brigham, 15, and Lorenzo Dow Young, age 9, came to live with her. It's here where Brigham Young learned the trade of carpenter and painter and glazier. And then we don't know if he continued living with her there, but it looks like Lorenzo probably remained with her and her family until he was old enough to go out and work. But in 1822, just 7 years later, which Lorenzo would have been 16 years old, Susanna's husband, James, died. And also that same year, Eliza Little, their daughter that had been born just 4 years earlier, also died. So lots of sadness in Susanna's life that year with her husband and her daughter dying. And she moved, caring for her 3 boys and perhaps her brother Lorenzo, although that isn't completely clear. And she moved to act as a household servant to Richard A. Oliphant in February of 1825. It's not clear for sure if they ever got married. According to family records, she was married in February of 1825 to Richard A. Oliphant, but that's not completely clear whether that was a marriage or just a household servant relationship. And Charles Henry Oliphant was born in November, 15 November of 1825, and then she left Richard because he was so abusive. And that may have been an employment relationship and not necessarily a husband-wife relationship. It's not clear from remaining records. In 1829, Susanna was in Mendon, New York, and her father, John Young, and most of her family her siblings were living all within a 10-mile radius of Mendon, New York, in that same area. And in the 1830 census in Mendon, Susanna showed with one male, less than 5, which would have been Charles Henry Oliphant, one male, 5 to 10, which would have been James, her son, at 8 years old, and Fairmore's, her son, was bound out to Solomon Chamberlain of Springwater, New York, at the age of 8, and he worked on the farm in the summer and attended school in the winter. Being bound out was common to help the children grow up, especially for a single mother trying to raise multiple children. Edwin, at this time 14, was not with his mother. He may have been living with an uncle, and he isn't found with another family member, so not completely clear. When she married William Stillson, Charles Henry Oliphant, our ancestor, if you noticed, 1829, was still living with her. But he wrote, Charles Henry Oliphant wrote that his stepfather was cruel to Susanna's children. Charles was whipped for little childish indiscretions. Charles says that William was a whiskey drinker and a very sick man, and they all suffered because they lacked for the necessities of life. The family later moved to Rochester, where Susanna placed Charles in the home of Ezekiel and Lucretia Fox in 1831 or 1832, when he was just 6 or 7 years old. Charles never saw his mother again. I'll touch on that again a little later. Susanna had told them that Charles' name was Charles Little, told the Foxes when he gave him to them. It was later that he learned that his name was Charles Oliphant from his brothers, James and Fairmore's, who visited him. The Youngs didn't keep in contact with Charles. Both Brigham and Joseph did keep in contact, though. Brigham Young, his uncle, and Joseph Young, his uncle, visited him and taught him the gospel of Jesus Christ as a youth. He did not join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at that time, though. I'll mention that a little bit later. So the 3 children that were born to William Stillson and her were named Emmeline Stillson, only lived 2 years old, and William Stillson, and then so William Jr., I guess you would call it, because the father's name is William, but they got different middle names. And then Cornelia Ann Stillson was born in 1836, and this husband died in 1844. She also married an Alonzo Pettingill in 1846 in Nauvoo, Illinois. We'll touch more on that in a moment. In 1832, the extended Young family, almost all of them joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Joseph Young, Susanna's brother, baptized her and her husband, William Stillson, and also baptized her brother John at the same time in April of 1832. And Rhoda, another sister, was baptized at the same time. Fanny, Louisa, Lorenzo also. So the whole family organized in Mendon. Many of them became members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with Heber C. Kimball and 12 others. Won't take time to talk about all of them, although there's church history on each one of them, including Rhoda Young Green, and lots of information there. They were in a corner of New York that was also near Ohio and Pennsylvania. And based on the birth of the children, Susanna and William moved to Ohio, just a few miles away, where William Lacey was born in September of 1833 at Wellsville, Columbiana, Ohio. William had probably found work there, and then on the 22nd of May of 36, Cornelia Ann, their daughter, was born at Little Beaver, Pennsylvania. So Wellville and Little Beaver were both near the Pennsylvania-Ohio state line and a reasonable distance from Kirtland, Ohio. After Cornelia's birth, William Stilson left Susanna and their children to join the Army, but didn't communicate with her at all for several years. I'll mention him again a little later also. Susanna followed her family to Kirtland, Ohio, to be with the saints, and then James, her son, age 17, who I mentioned had been let out to the Bountons, he said he'd had enough abuse, he'd been beaten enough, and he visited his uncle Malcolm Little and then his brother Fairmore's. And James then found lodging with a good family and spent the next 2 years teaching school. And in the spring of 1841, James went to Rochester, New York, visited with Charles Oliphant, our ancestor, but there was no mention of his brother Edwin at this time. James then traveled on to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he worked all summer. And then in the fall, his employer cheated him of all of his earnings by taking out bankruptcy. He eventually decided to go to Nauvoo to see his mother and other relatives. Susanna had moved from Kirtland to Nauvoo in 1840, and at Nauvoo, and she was a single mother at that time, she probably stayed with her son, Edwin Little. He was not there all the time, as he was called on missions from time to time. And we don't have a baptism date for Edwin, but it's obvious that he was active in the church. Susanna was probably with him until his marriage, and when Edwin married Harriet Amelia Decker in March of 42, and Edwin's young uncle, Joseph Young, performed that ceremony. This is Susanna's brother, Joseph Young. 2 years later, in August of 1844, they had a son, George, born in Nauvoo, and there's a lot more information on Edwin. Susanna was living in impoverished circumstances while in Nauvoo because Brigham Young listed in his daybook the clothes and items given to Susanna. And probably late in 1842, Susanna's son James arrived in Nauvoo. He'd not seen his mother for several years. He was poorly clad and found everyone in Nauvoo in a similar situation, including his mother. James found work doing day labor and then got a position as a teacher, and he renewed with his acquaintance with the young relatives. And he said that he only saw his brother Edwin once while in Nauvoo. So they moved to St. Louis and back to Nauvoo because there was a lot of sickness in the families in Nauvoo, and trying to bring food and help care for the sick, James became ill. That's Susanna's son. He was cared for by his mother, Susanna, at the home of his Aunt Fanny Murray, Susanna's sister. Later, he moved his mother to a location about 16 miles from Nauvoo by his uncle Lorenzo. And then here he built her a log cabin to stay in. About this time, James' mother heard from her husband, William Stilson, who was in the United States Army, stationed near St. Louis. St. Louis is a few hours from where they lived. And so Susanna, her daughter Cornelia, and James, along with a cousin, went to St. Louis to be with him. And we don't hear about William Lacey, who would have been 10 at this time. We assume he was in Nauvoo helping or working for one of his uncles. James joined the Army when his stepfather reenlisted, and Fairmore's came to St. Louis to find his family. He had not seen his brother James in about 10 years. Fairmore's went into the grocery business, also farmed and taught school both in St. Louis and Nauvoo. And William Stilson at this time took ill. And when James' regiment marched out from St. Louis, and a few days later, in 1843, William died of lung fever. And so this brief reunion with Susanna and her husband William was shortened by his death in 1843. Fermors, living in St. Louis, took her and Cornelia in and took care of them. And in 1844, Fermors, with his mother Susanna and Cornelia, moved back to Nauvoo. James served in the Mexican War but never had to fight. I know a lot of history in Nauvoo, just trying to capture some of the things that happened there. In Nauvoo, 1846, Susanna and Alonzo Pettingill were married and sealed in the Nauvoo Temple. Both Alonzo and Susanna Young had been endowed in January. Not much is known of the life of Alonzo Pettingill. The best information comes from the Land and Records Office at Nauvoo. Alonzo was born in 1801 in New York. His father and mother, Elihu Pettingill and Sanna Woolworth. He was in Kirtland, Ohio, when Joseph Smith called him to be a member of Zion's camp, where Brigham and Joseph knew him. He was a high priest in Nauvoo, so he was faithful. He was a quiet, unobtrusive man. Alonzo, being faithful in the Latter-day Saint Church. Susanna's marriage to Brother Pettingill was probably a happy one, for he was a good man and not abusive like several of her husbands had been. Well, she moved to Salt Lake, Utah. Susanna Young, now Pettingill, moved to Salt Lake with her son, James, and her daughter, Cornelia. And they're not sure exactly when. It shows in the records that she came across in Brigham Young's company, but the family records dated as 1849 when they arrived in Salt Lake. James provided a home for Susanna, Cornelia, and himself. Due to years of hardship, Susanna survived only a few years in Salt Lake. She was there for James' marriage to marry Jane Lytle. This is James Little, remember, to marry James Lytle in December of 1849. And at the same time, she received a letter from Charles Henry Oliphant informing her that he was coming to Utah. She died she received this letter just a few days before her death on 5 May of 1852, and it made her very happy. Charles Henry Oliphant's story is another one that I'll tackle another week, and there's a lot of clues in Susanna Young's story about Charles Henry Oliphant and what happened to him. Thank you very much, and I hope you are enjoying the life of our ancestors as we look at how they lived their life and what they did to tackle the trials and challenges that were given to them.